visit you. And yeah,
I can make a risotto.
Oh, risotto, perfect.
Oh, risotto.
Great. And nachos as well. We got some gratitude. Who's leading? Is this who's leading this one, Nika?
I can take Matt, no problem. Like it's three of us here.
Yeah.
Because hang on. I'll switch my video off just to make sure the connection is okay for now. But yeah, so it's three of us. It's Steve, me, and Vasily. We are all doing like one section of from the paper. It's very nice that like it's kind of divided into like the piece on mythic communism, then everyday communism, and then it ends on conclusions. So we all each taking a piece basically. So I think, yeah, without much ado, I will hand it over to Steve to get us started.
All right, thanks. So this piece, it continues some of the discussion that we had begun in the last reading group about how definitions of property come to connect to structures of violence, and how at any given moment there's a production of the bourgeois form, but within a larger production of this reality in which there's also mutual aid. And if not for that mutual aid, the bourgeois form would not exist. So what DavidGreaber sets out to do in this article is to recover a definition of communism in its everyday sense, and to separate it from its mythic history that's taken shape since the term really was adopted by Marx. So he gives an accounting of this history. And the term communist was used prior to the 1830s, but it was really in between 1835 and 1845 that Marx used it to refer to a kind of life that would exist after the revolution of, as he was hoping for in 1848, would overthrow capitalism and would begin this new phase. So he took pains not to describe what life would look like after communism or after the revolution. And the most that he really postulated was the idea that it would require a dictatorship of the proletariat to usher in this period where property was abolished. And what Graeber points out in his historical excavation is that Marx relied on a very typical kind of notion of primitive Homo sapiens, of primitive communism, and he really started his understanding of communism from that idea. He tried to make a distinction in terms of prescriptive statements that once the revolution triumphed, those distinctions between what was work, what was leisure, wouldn't really exist anymore. And what Graeber's able to tease out from this is that if we really think about divisions of labor, private property, and social inequality, because all of those Marx postulated would vanish after the revolution, they're in essence bound up. They're products of the same system. They're really one and the same thing. And so what Marx hoped for in a post-capitalist or communist world was a overcoming of alienation, and that humans would recapture that socialism, that sociality, that humanism between them. So in 1848, when Marx and Engels published the manifesto, it forever linked the term communism with the specific project that Marx and Engels took on. And so that term, it already had a mythic history, but its mythic importance grew. If we think of the origin of the myth, it's this myth of a primitive Homo sapien way back when, which as part of David's larger project, but in other publications, he tries to show that how actually so-called sophisticated societies and primitive societies existed alongside one another, and so it's a false distinction to make. So this term was forever linked with Marx and Engels, and really became codified in the first Congress of the Comintern in 1919. Because of its association with Lenin, because Lenin rooted his own ideas in Marxist premises, especially about the dictatorship of the proletariat. What this then allowed Lenin to do, and this became part of the mythic history, is it linked communism forever less with a social movement, because it really is an ideology about alienation, about alternatives to alienation in a society that are outside of these structures of commerce. But it ended up becoming associated forever with the Communist Party. And so it too became an ideology, but an ideology of a vanguardist party and less of a vision for society. And it's especially ironic because this is this ideology, capital C communism, that's associated with the party. The governments, the totalitarian regimes that have propagated this kind of communism have, by their own definition, never reached that communist stage, because they are still in a socialist stage, which helps legitimize the rule of a vanguard party, because they can make the point that they're still in a phase of dictatorship of the proletariat. So the one question that I think is worth considering is, given the bloodshed that is on the mythic history of communism, is there a value in recovering? There's a danger in recovering this term, but is there even is it worth the risk of using this term when so many people have a misunderstanding of it? And I ask that just as an open question, without any sort of inclination or interest in whether or not people want to take up that question or not. Okay, let me pass it over to my comrade.
Yes, will do. No, thanks much, Shivan. I think just picking up on your last point, I think like that's one of the reasons I really like this section on communism, where I think David is, it's more like, I think part of it, what he's trying to do, I guess, is telling us like this untold history of communism, or as a term. And a lot of it seems surprising, even though it really shouldn't be. So, like something like the fact that Karl Marx did not coin the term communism as such, or that he didn't even like come up with that principle of from each according to their ability to each according to the mean. Like it was in use at least for like 2 or 3 decades before Marx wrote it down in like Critique of the Gotha program. So I feel like part of it, like the reason this reading has been really helpful, at least to me, is in like discovering all these pieces of information which I really wasn't aware of, and that's how David, I guess, segues into this second aspect or second like meaning of what communism takes, which is everyday communism. And he kind of gets to his point, I think, through like in two acts, so to speak. So firstly, he talks about communism as a form of cooperation, because it seems like that's something that a lot of us might be exposed to on an everyday basis, So one question you can consider, it's like we almost experienced it at the beginning of like this call, where we were all sharing our recipes like that we are really good at making. And I would imagine, if some of us, all of us, we get the chance to meet, like one instinctive thing we could have done is, we would share food with each other. And that's something that, like humans do naturally, that we have a certain pleasure in doing as well, that we are sort of sharing things with each other. But it's natural to the point that it's not something we consider like significant, or it's not something we are like too conscious about. And that's something that David does in this section, right? He makes us conscious about this particular type of behavior that we participate in every day almost, So, you can think about an act of communism that you might have experienced today, or at least once or twice this week, where someone might have helped you out or cooperated with you without asking for anything in return. Or you might have done that same thing for someone else. So that's what everyday communism is in one way. It's a form of, it is cooperation. And I think one of the bigger, I guess, scandals you can say that David talks about is how this is the kind of behavior that actually keeps the most capitalist enterprises alive, Because, if you look into, say, like the world of technology, or if you look at Silicon Valley, one of the biggest like the headlines that they share is that communism just doesn't work. That's why we have to be capitalist. But David, I think, gives a pretty convincing example of how, like even in Silicon Valley companies, what actually makes them work so well and what helps them make a lot of money is that people cooperate with each other. And like, of course, outside the company, it's a very different story. But if you are an employee in like a tech company or in a startup, it's very intentionally like you freely share ideas with each other. And all the while you don't know this, but in your contract it's written that any idea you come up is the sole property of your employer. Come up with ideas so that can like lead to like the next big product, I guess. So if you go to a tech company, like any of the big ones, you'll see some similarities. Like people share food all the time. There's free food. People have free devices, which they exchange with each other. There's open access to internal documentation and so on. So it is a sort of, ironically, a culture of communism, and that's what has led to a lot of these tech companies become really big. So I think that's another way in which David is redeeming communism as a sort of cooperation, and it's something he mentions in the paper as well. But I think like, so there's a lot of useful information already if you start thinking of communism as an everyday thing, as a form of cooperation. But then in the next section, David takes it to like almost like the next level, right? Where he wants to see like, can we see communism as a sort of baseline principle that certain types of action possible? Maybe communism or everyday communism makes the very idea of society possible, and that's what he talks about in communism as a baseline sociality. So it's when when we are presented with situations where someone asks something from us, and either the cost for us is quite low. If someone comes to me asking for like a pen, for example, or even some water, like I don't have any issues in giving that to them without wondering like, okay, what do I get back for it? Or if like that person's need is really grave, like a moment of crisis. So like just today, this morning, I think there was an earthquake in New Zealand, in the north of New Zealand. I'm actually not sure how serious it was, but I found out about it. But like if there is, say, a natural disaster, for example, people tend to come together and cooperate to save each other. It's less about saving themselves, but about each other. You see that example with, Hurricane Katrina in the US. In fact, I think in the early 1900s, I forget who it was, but there was a famous Japanese anarchist who was visiting San Francisco. And that's just when the big earthquake happened in San Francisco. And he saw that people are kind of helping each other and like cooperating with each other without really worrying about money or what they get in return, So he saw that principle of from each according to their abilities to each according to their means at work, like in person. So like in such moments, we do see this kind of sociality come alive. And what David wants to convince us, I guess, is that this kind of behavior is a sort of baseline sociality. It does kind of really make society as a whole possible, and I think I do feel personally that it is convincing. Like one question I was thinking was, could you just say this for anything else? Like, is there, could you identify some other behavior, like, I don't know, mimicry or copying each other as an organizing principle? But I guess that's not really the case. I think with communism, at least everyday communism, the sort of way in which you see each other as equals, there is a very specific principle of exchange at work, and like, which is why it's a form of sociality, I suppose. But I think like the other important thing here is that David also mentions a couple of other principles. So one is just exchange amongst people who don't know each other, and the other is hierarchy. So it's a sort of unilateral exchange where you're giving something to someone because they are your superior. And it's interesting that like there's other principles at work as well. And I think David's point is that in any society, you'll see these kinds of three principles at work, like they're coexisting, So communism is not something that you impose, it's just something that exists. And then you have big C, like mythic communism, which is just one of many ways to organize these types of socialities, So big C communism is almost like one attempt, just like capitalism, to tap into this sort of baseline sociality and sort of orient it to a specific purpose, So I think that's something that's very helpful, and at least it was very clarifying for me to understand. I guess like just as a final thing, I'll end on like a quick note to like 3 other papers which you might be interested in learning about. So one is his chapter from the Debt book, in which he fleshes out this idea of small c or everyday communism a bit more. He also talks about hierarchy and exchange a lot more in that chapter. I think it's chapter 5. So that's if you want to read more, like that's one place you can go to. There's also in his book called Possibilities, there's his very first chapter on manners. That's very interesting because he talks about the role of manners in Western society in reinforcing relations of hierarchy, And in that paper, he kind of talks about relations of equality between people. And he hints towards this kind of idea of communism, I think communism, like everyday communism, does presume that you are transacting with equals, that you have a sort of continuity with the other person. So that's another paper which you might find interesting. And then there's the other one, which I think it's a shorter article that David wrote on play. It's about play as an organizing principle of the whole universe, So he's being super provocative, but I think there's something to be said there. So just like communism between people is what makes society possible, he also looks at play, because play is a form of pleasure that we all, I think, enjoy. And it's defined by the fact that play, like there's a difference between play and games, like with games, there are rules that all the parties follow, and that's kind of what makes them pleasurable. With play, it's kind of like this sort of absence of rules, which is what makes it pleasurable, but which might also make it dangerous. And this is something what he talks about in the paper. So these are these 3 other nice papers that are also really interesting, and I think build up on this idea of everyday communism in various different ways. And yeah, I think with that, I will pass it on to Vasily to conclude.
Hello. I'm going to be brief so that we can have a discussion about it. I'm just going to start with the typology. At the end of the chapter, in the conclusion, Greaber comes up with a typology of 3 different forms of relations that can define economic relations, and thus he says human relations. So you have communism, exchange, and hierarchy. So communism is based on the principle from the principle that from each according to their abilities, etc. Exchange is based on the principle of reciprocity. Hierarchy is based on the principle of precedent. And so relations based on exchange are temporary, while those based on communism or hierarchy are permanent, and thus don't involve any proper calculation. Except that communism, of course, is equalitarian and hierarchy is obviously not. So there are many typologies of this sort in anthropology and sociology. So there is, of course, there is Polanyi's typology, but you can also find one in Descola book about culture and nature, in Testa as well. But I think what's remarkable about Graeber's typology is that Graeber gives a prominence to the gift, because in fact the gift is everywhere. In communism, it's gift giving between siblings or even friends, like in Moss's example. Oh, I'm going to share the quote by Moss where he talks about communism, which is actually quite confusing because there is reciprocity in the sentence. It's a quote that you can also find in his book on value. In communistic relationship, he gives also more like ordinary example, like small courtesies, like asking for a light or a cigarette, and so on. So he's trying to extend that as much as possible. In this category they call exchange, you obviously can think about gift exchange, just like in Lévi-Strauss interpretation of Mauss, or even if you look at Bourdieu, they have this idea that gift and exchange are kind of the same thing. It's just a question of time, basically, of a time lapse. And in hierarchy, then it's gifts. There are gifts in a tribute system, for example. So that's quite different from Polanyi's typology or Testa or Descola, because for them, gift falls only into one category, which is most of the time in this category. For Polanyi, for example, it's category called reciprocity. For Graeber, it is basically everywhere, and this is actually quite interesting, quite insightful. Then he goes on about different, how this definition of communism can actually open up ways to think outside of capitalism, to imagine, in a sense, a way out of capitalism. So he says, that's the last paragraph, if we accept this definition of communism, it gives us a new perspective on capitalism. It is one way of organizing communism. So that might be a bit confusing, but in fact, if you replace the term communism in a sentence by solidarity, then it comes very clear. So it's a way of organizing solidarity, and you can think immediately have you can immediately have in mind ready-made example of that, like an example that we are not very fond of, like philanthrocapitalism, like the Bill Gates Foundation, or venture philanthropy. That is also a thing. Which is kind of the dark side of the Silicon Valley that, as opposed to what Yash was talking about. So just a brief introduction of the conclusion, and I think it would be good to discuss more. But I have also a few, there are a few issues with this paper, and I hope I can address them at some point during the reading group.
So Rob, go ahead. I think Rob raised his hand.
Thanks all three of you. That was really very interesting. I haven't actually so much got a comment or anything. I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to ask a question of Nika. And the reason I wanted to ask a question is because the first section in this essay about mythical communism, one of the examples of mythical communism which David refers to is the Soviet Union. And I think that Nika is possibly the only person in the room who actually lived in the Soviet Union and has got direct experience of it. And I'm interested in her experience there. I wonder if I can ask you, Nika, particularly if you were, I think you were at school in the Soviet Union, were you aware of socialism? I suppose it would have been more precisely than communism, but these ideologies, were they part of your schooling when you were a youngster living in that, under that system?
Yeah, it was funny because we were told to memorize the Marx definition of communism one day. I remember that. And none of us was able to understand what we should memorize because it was practically not there. That's referred to what Steve was saying about Marx. He actually didn't talk a lot at all about how the life would be precisely conducted after the revolution. So that was up to Grab, and that's what so the government did. Yeah, I think this is, Soviet society was very atomized, and solidarity, like in every human society, was there for sure, but it was just a different way of problematic than capitalism, because it was like monopolistic capitalism. It wasn't socialism at all. You know, probably Scandinavia was socialism. That's what Gorbachev was saying when he started perestroika. He coined the phrase socialism of human face, and he was deliberately talking about Scandinavian model. Naomi Klein in her book published the, I think it's called Roman Club documentation, how all this attempt to save good part of Soviet Union social system was destroyed by basically by the investors who have their own interest. Yeah, thank you for asking.
Did you do history at school, and were you taught history as a sort of a dialectical process in a Marxist type of a way? I mean, when I was at school, I suppose we were taught the typical kings and queens and how important these people were, and we probably, you know, I didn't realize at the time that it was fairly ideological what we were being taught. But I wonder if how was the history of the Russian Revolution portrayed, and something like that in schools in the Soviet Union?
So it was very ideological as well. For example, Russian Revolution was started by the woman who marched to in Petrograd because of the starvation and war. But Trotsky even changed the date of revolution, and it's become the date of the army celebration of the army. Originally, it was 8th of March, the Woman Day. So it was quite ideological, but in a different way, of course. So we were not told, we were told that queen and queens, of course, vampires, which they were, but we also taught that, you know, so I study Hegelian philosophy a little bit at university, and we had a cool professor who's very popular, and he was saying like, okay, if you want to find out very quickly what was the first, the material or about Hegel, or the how you call it in English, not
Idealism.
no, idea. Yeah, you just go to this cabinet number 24, and Madame Petrova will tell you that in 1 minute. You know, so of course everything was just very simplistic and very ideologically charged. But I also want to come back to the question, to Steve's question about should we recover the brand of communism, and I would say yes, we have to, we must. That's the major things we should fight for, because if we will be able to recover that, everything will totally change. I think it's like a symbolic code of the society, and when the people understand something, like many people, to be like this critical mass, the public consensus, then the society will change. And David also writing about that in many books. Like he was in that, I think he was saying that in Europe was no slavery on the European soil after Roman Empire almost, and so on and so forth. So I think it's extremely important to do that. I don't know what other people think. What do you think, Steve? Should we recover the notion of communism or not? Should we try to fight for that, for the real definition of what communism is as a solidarity and the way to arrange social relationship instead of being this ideological party bloody brand?
Mona was asking for the floor.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of respond to what Nika was saying and also respond to Steve's question. And I agree we should for multiple reasons, primarily because it's also part of a historical relearning, you know, and I think that's part of what David's essay is really, is giving us that history to set those terms free, but also, I mean, the etymology of the words themselves, going back to meaning, right? And I think, you know, part of the activities that have happened, you know, with the brand of communism is the removal of meaning, right, from language. So just at that point, maybe, I don't know what everyone thinks.
Can I say something?
I think Elizabeth also has her hand up too.
I can go after.
I don't mind. Are we using hands? Is that how we're using to sequence this? Using the digital hand, I can do that too. I'm happy to wait till you speak, Elizabeth.
I was just experimenting because I wasn't sure when it would fit. I wonder, this essay was really transformative for me. I think TJ passed it along to me a few weeks ago, and I had kind of, along with the series of essays that Nika and David wrote about art and the symbolic order, like a lot of things kind of came together for me. And, you know, I kind of came out the other side of this essay, like convinced that I was a communist, and I had to like sit my husband down and tell him like, I have something to tell you. And no one I talked to was surprised at all. But it was never something that I had dedicated a lot of my own like thinking to. And one of the things that, and this is a kind of a naive question because this isn't an area of expertise for me, but I think a lot about the time in which mythic communism is rising and how it correlates with, you know, the rise of nationalism as an ordering of the world. And what I really love about the Museum of Care and this essay is this opportunity to rethink communism deterritorialized from nation. And I feel like if we're on the topic of rebranding, I feel like that's a really interesting, exciting part of that for me, because I feel like capitalism has already succeeded, right, in going transnational and kind of circumventing the structures of nationalism. And I feel like there's so many beautiful, creative things we can do and think about in terms of doing that with communism. That's all I was gonna say.
Good. Michael, you're gonna add as well something?
Yeah, thank you very much for letting me know this was happening, and also for the introduction to the chapter, which I read in the hour or so before the session. But it was, I like that kind of question, because it seems to me that the world, or that was asked by Steve, because we've seen in the last 10 years a huge series of new uprisings, and you know, you speak to some people on the liberal left and it's all doom and gloom. But as far as I can see, all the isms, all the progressive emancipatory isms are back on the agenda again and being discussed by young people. And what's surely important, though, is to consider history and to realize that kind of zealotry and belief and activism isn't necessarily enough. You need to kind of know what you're doing in some way. And the road to hell was, you know, paved with good intentions in a particular kind of way in the 20th century. Things went well, but also went badly. And I think this chapter is really valuable in that it starts to open up our minds and help us to discuss very important subjects, the language, but also the actual meaning of this kind of terminology, socialism, or whether we should be making blueprints for utopia or not, and to what extent. I think they're really, I think activists need to also be sort of theoretical in some way simultaneously. I think it's really crucial. And we possibly don't know the reasons why, let's call it Stalinism, bureaucratic forms of socialism, which were in some cases okay, in some cases repressive, in other cases brutal. We need to know why. I think.
Well, I see there's like a lot of discussion in the chat as well, so definitely feel free to add in on the call as well.
Simona wants to speak.
Oh, Simona, go for it, please. Yes.
Are we doing the raised hand thing in the sidebar?
Yes, that's probably best. Simona was first, then Nika, then Michael, then Rachel.
As soon as, okay. I couldn't reactivate my audio. So maybe I'll be out of the thread of this discussion as it has been until now. But one thing that was enlightening for me in the last discussion we had about mode of production is a short note by Yash about maybe this is not anymore capitalism. And actually, David said, no, this is not anymore capitalism. This is managerial feudalism. And what has changed is that production is not anymore the center, because capitalism is a mode of production aimed to the production of merchandises, commodities. It's for the market. This is the essential feature in my interpretation of Marx. But an enormous display of commodities is a modern world. This is the incipit of the capital. And what happens when production is not anymore the center? The everyday communism, the cooperation, that is also the most efficient way to product stuff, becomes less and less important. And this is key to understand the modern present day world to me. And this is also making me so few optimistic on the way out. I come from Italian operaist tradition, whose key concept was it is workers that compel capitalism to innovate and to become more efficient, exactly because they don't want to work, so they try to make it the most efficient, as much efficient as possible, in order to work less. And this efficiency is stolen by capitalists. So what happens when efficiency is not anymore the problem? What happens where production is not anymore the problem? It happens that you have not anymore workers' power. The name of Italian operaism was potere operaio, that means power of the workers. And so we need a political solution for this. And this was my first thought on the everyday communism that is cooperation. The second important thing in this paper by David is the idea of unicity that is in mythic communism. In my opinion, this comes not only from Messianism and from ancient traditions, but also from Rousseau' general will, idea of a general will. The idea that the community will is always good, and if you are against this general will, you are mistaken, but you don't know that you are mistaken. In my opinion, this is the most awful feature of theoretical communism, as of Marxism and of real socialism. And it's not just something that happened because of bureaucracy or because of historical happenings. It is inside the very core of this idea of communism as a general will, of the idea of proletarians as a general class that expresses the unique need of the society. So I sorry for speaking so long. I'll be quiet from now. Who's the facilitator tonight? I shall do it if everybody else.
Sure. Yeah, Adrian, Simona, like happy to do the final lap. I can. Oh.
Couldn't quite hear you, Yash, but I think Rachel was next if we're just going down by the list.
Got it.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you very, very much for having me. This is my first time in the reading group. I'm very, very thrilled to be here. And I would like to just say very quickly, as somebody that does speak like a second language, everybody that is speaking about these incredibly complex things in your second language, like fucking hats off to you. I don't think I could do it in mine. So I just wanted to say that. So I have a couple of points. Like, first of all, about the rebranding of communism. I think that as David frames it so brilliantly, which is that capitalism is just a reorganization of communism, because communism is about our relationships, how we relate to one another. I think that immediately depolarizes communism, which is obviously what needs to happen if the movement's going to go forward. But I think that the other thing that a rebrand needs to do is still to engage with the realities that the atrocities that have been done in the name of communism. David calls it mythic capitalism, mythic communism. I'm not sure even if that's the correct term, because so many people on the left, let alone on the right, are put off because of the totalitarian state and the war crimes that, or the crimes against humanity that were essentially done. And that is, I think, important because people are getting more and more fed up with capitalism because of the reality of capitalism. So then we need to also talk about the reality of totalitarianism when it appears on the left. Another point was to go into the text, it immediately made me think of roles when David was talking about hierarchies, or comparing the primitive society versus modern society, and what a utopia would look like, that somebody could go hunting in the morning and fishing in the afternoon. And Marx talks about that essentially that is about removing somebody's role to allow them to function as a human in a community. So I started thinking about other ways in which roles are essentially stifling to this communism, which is about, you know, providing or fulfilling each other's needs when they arise. And I thought, well, maybe that's why flat hierarchies, which we do see a lot on the left, they don't function particularly well because, yes, there might not be that superiority, but it's still boxing people into roles as opposed to letting them function according to their own abilities. And funnily enough, I read an article a couple of months ago and I did some reading around it. There's this management style that's employed by Starbucks. Now hear me out. It's employed by Starbucks. And it essentially does not put employees into roles, but employs them for their abilities, so that when a given situation arises, teams are allowed to self-organize and form around the problem, provide their input. It means that the leadership is constantly in flux as well. And it's called like the teal management system or whatever. And I was like, oh my God, that's communism in the workplace there. That's I think one of the most amazing examples, done maybe for the wrong reasons, but because it exists in this extremely corporate environment, what could we do with it? Who else could we convince with it? Where else could we apply it? And I think that's really, really exciting. Yeah, and then the final thing before I'll give up the floor. I'm very excited, as y'all can see. The one issue I take with David's text is the underlying trust that pins society. I'm not sure after decades and decades of neoliberalism that trust is intrinsically present anymore. I think we need to study the psychology of it, of the effects of neoliberalism. And Nika, you mentioned Naomi Klein. She wrote the book Disaster Capitalism or Shock Capitalism, about how the US essentially managed to undo communism and liberate the free market all over the world by causing these natural disasters, well, not causing natural disasters, but taking advantage of a culture, a society going into shock because they become more agreeable. I wonder, when we're discussing moments of communism in a neoliberal society after hurricanes or after a terrorist event or whatever, when a community comes together, does that also not play into the same formula of shock? And if so, can we then start to compare communism and capitalism, not even just as these ideological polarities, but as, oh, I don't even know. No, I'm going beyond myself here. Yes, trust. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Yes, Ellen, I know you raised your hand as well. Would you like to go next?
I think this is really a wonderfully resourceful essay that enables us to be able to cut through a lot of very negative rhetoric and to preserve the ideas at the heart of caring for other people. And the connection then with, you know, the Museum of Care, or the idea of care and freedom as being fundamental, seems to be at the heart of what is being talked about here. And the fact that it's now associated with things that can't be defended, I think is just something we have to expect. I mean, I think that if we're trying to stand in this terrain, it's going to be contested. And there are all kinds of ways in which people will disparage efforts that have been made to create communism because of the way some things turned out. You also have to look at, say, all of the violence and crimes against humanity that have been created in the name of democracy. No matter what term we're going to use, we're going to have to make an argument. It's going to be contested. So I don't think we should worry about necessarily what everybody else calls something. I think keeping firmly on the ground of what people are actually doing, looking at the everyday practices of care and how people arrive at making those kinds of decisions and build those kinds of structures is just a really good thing to do. And I think one finds that too, I think one doesn't have to only excavate it within that thing that I think David put in quotes, the so-called Western world. You can find it in the capitalist world that came through a different route as well. And certainly in China, there are lots of people who are trying to recuperate socialism and who haven't thought they've been living in socialism for a really long time. So basically these are debates that I think are useful to engage, and I'm really happy to be engaging in these here. So thank you.
No, thank you, Ellen. Everyone, so just we'll do I know there's a few questions. Just before that, is it okay if we make a couple of announcements and then come back to continuing with the questions? If that works with everyone, just being mindful of time. Sounds good, sounds good. So yeah, two real quick ones. So I think for the next reading group that's happening on March 12th, we have a very special guest, Cassie Thornton, who has written a book very much founded on the principles of care, which of course with Museum of Care we are really interested in. She has this really great concept called the hologram. It's a very practical approach. So it's definitely something that you'd read and you'd be able to apply in your own life with friends. So it's a very interesting idea of reclaiming ability to care, in these times. So it'd be great to have Cassie over, and we'll share the reading with you soon as well. So that's next Friday, 12th of March at 8 p.m. UK time. That's the first one. And then the second one is very soon we also have the anniversary of the Paris Commune, 150th anniversary on 18th of March. So we are planning a themed party on that Friday, so which is the 19th. So keep an eye out in your inboxes. We will send you invitations and more details on what we'll be doing. So yeah, two more things to look forward to in the coming Fridays, yeah. And with that, we'll go back to the questions. And I think, Amy, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. Sorry. My question was related to what Simona was talking about. When I was reading about the idea of everyday communism, I've also just been reading about the history of Confederate monuments in the South, and I was just starting to watch a film about SNCC by Danny Lyons. And so I was also thinking about the aspect of community that can be so dehumanizing, polarized, violent against itself. And as Simona was saying, that if we are insisting on an idea that the community logic has some sort of value, inherent value to it, how do we deal with the opposite of everyday communism, which is maybe everyday genocide? I don't know, but I mean, that communities are torn against each other and where people see each other as less than human.
Yeah, I think, Anshul, you had a point as well?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say this. I think someone was talking about trust and the role that trust plays in this text. And I just wanted to say that I think trust is directly proportional to inequality. And I think something that we have been seeing in India is that there's this trust into ethical wealth creation, and that growth will somehow deal with inequality. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if I'm echoing. Yeah, yeah. So this idea that somehow economic growth will deal with inequality, and these things are sort of tied to each other. And so what that creates is this mistrust in the entire arena. And I also feel that inequality in and of itself is ideological and political rather than being anything else. And perhaps it should also be tackled in that way. That's all. Thank you.
And I think Matt, you also had a point.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. One, kind of touching on what Rachel was saying is about Starbucks. Like, yeah, they use what works. I think David said in the essay about tech being a bit more democratic in their workflows. And actually, so I actually worked in the government and got really tired of how bureaucratic it was and like hierarchical. And I intentionally moved to tech just because, I mean, it's not perfect, but I mean, there's a lot of problems with it, but like the daily work would be less just do stuff, even though I think it's stupid. That wouldn't happen much less on a daily level than it did in the government. So yeah, they do what works. And I think that's the whole theme. It's like they do what works, but then say, no, that's impossible to ever work because you can't actually do things on top of cooperation and communism, but then they do things based on cooperation and communism, which is the inherent contradiction. Another one of the things, I think Yash mentioned some of David's writings about manners and middle-class manners and all this. And it's one of the things that I found really in my own kind of like middle-class bourgeoisie upbringing. My wife is from Mexico, and she has this very common phrase where she's from Mexico that's basically the equivalent of, hey, would you mind passing me the salt? But the literal translation is don't be bad. And I was always like, that's a really weird way of saying, don't be bad, hand me the salt. I'm like, I never said anything, but then actually later when I read one of David's writings about that, I was like, wait a second. You would have to be a bad person for us to be sitting at the table and being like, hey, can I have the salt? And they're really like, no, you can't have it. Like, it's one of those things that like again, it didn't make sense to me, but when you think about it, like if you assume that daily communism is the norm, which it is, don't be bad makes absolute sense as a saying, but like me and my own US whatever upbringing, kind of that sounded weird to me, but now it doesn't. So.
I think Vasily, I think you had something to add as well, right? Early on.
Oh no, I've already talked. So if
Yash,
someone who didn't,
Michael's had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, got it. No, over here, Michael.
I suppose on the issue of rebranding communism, it's very much like whether or not you are rebranding anarchism or trying to resuscitate it. It might be just a tactical issue rather than thinking about some kind of future. We need to rebrand communism so we can bring a future. Aren't you just recreating mythic communism and your revolution is in the future? But I find the essay really a nice essay because it just kind of goes with the everyday, and you get to say, oh, it's all there. But to me, it's more of a tactical issue in your own community, whether or not you associate yourself with the word communism, or whether you need to, or whether or not you associate yourself with the word anarchism. Like I don't typically use communism and all that excited about it. I was raised in America, and I was taught when I was a kid that the metric system was a communist plot. That's where what I kind of come up in the 80s. But the point I think is, as if you have anarchism with a small a, you get all kinds of people involved in it, and they're doing this kind of everyday communism, doing this everyday anarchism, doing this everyday sharing, doing organizing, saying, hey, this is right. If it suddenly then gets labeled from the outside as communism or anarchism, and then everybody says, oh, I thought that was just sharing, we were just being friends, you know. So it is good to kind of reclaim these words a little bit, even if you're not trying to build a mythic kind of future, and you're just trying to give people some of their own history, some of their own background, and some of their own words. And I think this essay does that really nice. I did want to kind of challenge a little bit what like Yash said, and I guess some other people said, oh, look, the tech industry is sharing. Well, that the issue of like the people working for, you know, a big company, and they say, oh, could you pass me the wrench, and they cooperate and they share. That happens all the time. People are trying to do something, and the tech industry is in fact working on people's sharing and then commodifying it, being able to capture it. And it's very, very subtle. And so I think we need to, it's really recapturing the commons instance. Sharing is a sort of commons, and they're stealing it. I do think it is nice that to work in the tech industry where people cooperate rather than government and a government bureaucracy. I do understand at an interpersonal level, it's a much nicer workplace to work, but I do think it's important to recognize that kind of reclaiming is, and it does raise the issue of, does this sharing and this communism, or like everyday anarchism, or whatever you want to call it, does it exist when we're larger and you have a technological differentiated society? It's mostly something that happens interpersonally, and I think that's great. Once you have a larger society, you have to think, and I think of myself as an anarcho-syndicalist, as in, I'm not sure about, you know, to each according to their means and to everyone, you know, what they need. I think if to everyone what they need, that's great. When you say everyone contributes, what happens if you creating more than you actually need, right? Who gets the extra? So there, you know, it starts to be, and it might also look at, if you just contribute and you don't get any reward, the psychology of that is poor, as in like people don't contribute. So there is like the difference, I think, might be in thinking about winner take all type of, I contributed a lot, so I get everything, or I contributed a lot, so I get, you know, slightly more. That might be so those are more practical things that are outside the remit of this article. And the only other point would be mythic capitalism. If capitalism functions on everyday communism, people cooperating, we should stop calling it capitalism because it's fake.
No, I definitely agree with your points, Michael. Like, and even with like, yeah, like to what you're saying about like who has the means to do more. Like, I wonder, like, does that almost lead to like discussions about means of production? You know, is that where we're ending up talking about, like, where, you know, if like someone owns most of the means of productions, then they can say that, oh yeah, like from each according to your ability, like then I should get the bulk of, like it's like the winner takes all mentality that you mentioned. You know, so like part of that is like, yeah, like that classic statement about who gets to own the more of production or means of production. But just throwing that out there. Any further questions? I think so we can. I would say you can just unmute and you can like raise your hand on the via Zoom. I think we are through the stack now, so I feel like, yeah, we can either just just unmute and talk, or you can just raise your hands. I've got my eyes on both.
I think Lane wanted to say something but couldn't raise his hand.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lane Hartzell, and thank you so much for allowing me in your group. The Museum of Care is a real intellectual powerhouse, and also with of course, with the activist practicality and credentials. I just have a brief observation on the language, which has been pointed out. Many times we hear, socialism doesn't work. That's pretty common. And then communism is a dream. But no one actually, except for this group maybe, but people don't realize that, does capitalism really work? I mean, as far as it doesn't look to me, I mean, with a coup d'etat against the United States that happened 2 months ago, it doesn't look like capitalism worked either. And if we read Adam Smith, and if you actually read him, capitalism would have gone out a long time ago. I mean, with slavery picked up capitalism quite quickly, and by the 1820s, Thomas Jefferson said the Enlightenment was gone. So I think that the question is, if we have some kind of good idea, capitalism or socialism or whatever, is how are you going to defend it against the concentrations of power that are going to typically come in? So if Leninist, Lenin was a very nice person, but if a Leninist comes in and says, well, we had good intentions, but it was taken over by Stalinism or something, for example, or the capitalist says, well, we had good intentions, but it was taken over by the slaveholders union and so forth. I think the question is not so much the good ideas, that's fine, but how are we going to defend it in the real world? I think Occupy had a lot to do with bringing a lot of these things out onto the national agenda in the world. And so I just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Thanks, Darlene. Anyone else? I think we can also comment on the chat if you want to jump in, because then there's also, I realize in my tablet I can't actually raise my hand, so if you can just type in on the chat as well.
If there's nobody else, I would like to jump in. Yeah, maybe that last year there has been a resolution from the European Parliament that equipares communism and Nazism. And this is something important because the battle about words is a very important political battle because words count in our imagination in the way we frame reality. And to say communism is like Nazism, or to say the only socialism possible, yes, reframe is the word. The way you call things is important because it has consequences on how you think things. And yes, every ism is a problem, but are we able as a humanity, as a huge group, to think without words? In studying philosophers, I saw, and Spinoza, of course, I saw that the main philosophical operation is to reframe the meaning of words. Spinoza's theological political treatise starts by explaining that the real meaning of the word spirit, ruha, is actually wind. And since this is used to say something very big and very strong, Ruha Yahweh can be just a very strong wind. And this reframing of the notion of spirit is very important to destroy the Calvinist frame of I understand the Bible because the Spirit of God is in me, and so I am inspired to find in the Bible everything until the way to raise tomatoes in my garden. Sorry for being so long and so distracted, but I just wanted to point out how important is to reframe or to frame names and to take back the original meaning of communism. By the way, the Commune of Paris, the name of Commune came from Italian comuni, the ancient self-organization of cities that started in Italian Middle Age. And that was very conflictual. Conflict was the nature of Italian commons, and very creative just by being conflictual. And I had another thing to say, but I forgot. So, yes. One very interesting thing that is rising is the thought about commons, about the management of commons. And I hope to take to this assembly somebody who can tell us which are the experiences of taking care of the commons, of managing, collectively managing the commons. There have been, there are some very interesting experiences that I would like to discuss with you.
Can I jump in? Oh, somebody else?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So talking about celebration of party of Paris Commune and reinventing the word, what is communism? I was personally thinking that since capitalism is practically don't exist, it's something maybe managerial feudalism, maybe something else, but it's not this capitalism that is sold in the books. The real intellectual opponents is not a capitalist, it's liberals, or the state socialism like China, for example. That's had a lot of power. And several of my friends are really admiring the Chinese regime that is totally ununderstandable for me, because the guys are running concentration camps on a mass scale with millions of people. How can you support that in any possible way? So I was thinking maybe we can introduce during this party, if TJ would support that, our project of fighting club that we try to develop. And we can try to invite, because it's a party, we can try to invite people to have a short debates. And it could be people with the real kind of, people who are really feel themselves anti-communist, let's say, or it could be people who's pretending, just like a spontaneous idea. I don't know if everybody would agree to. It will be interesting, and maybe if TJ will agree to help to prepare that, or maybe somebody from the group will volunteer to take a part in the short fight.
Indeed, I'm certainly up to help prepare that. It would be an interesting experiment, at least, in getting people to talk to each other and perhaps desensitizing us in some way to talking with people who have very different viewpoints. Now, will be antagonistic, yeah. I mean, usually when you speak with someone with a very different viewpoint, you don't want it to be too antagonistic, but this would be an interesting experiment in that direction, in my view at least, and I'd like to try it out if others would too.
I think that could be a cool idea. I think it would be a good idea if there was like the facilitation technique is like fishbowl, where you have like two people that are, like a small group, 2-3 people that are actually having the fight club. And then everyone around them can have a conversation, and maybe you can tag in and tag out, or like maybe in the chat, you can make your comments, but like, it's not just like 30 versus the guest, it's not crazy, but you still have like a debate back and forth, and you can have it structured maybe that way.
Yeah, we've also, we can, sorry.
No, I was just thinking how to find out, because it seems like we mostly agree. It's something that somehow it takes time to dig enough to find where is it exactly that we don't agree on.
I agree with that, and I also want to say that I feel like I have every conversation outside MOC is antagonistic for me. So I've had enough fights already to have more of them. But yeah, open to idea and sounds great. Let's have it.
I was
just to step real quick.
Not to fight between each other, but to invite some kind of other people from outside, because this is a very well described phenomenon that the people are talking to their peers, and creating these bubbles where they agree with each other and kind of refine the agreements. But actually the big world out there, and it's very interesting to see how it's worked and try to fill it out. So maybe we can invite for like 10 or 15 minutes fight some really obnoxious people, and I totally agree with Matt. Maybe anybody who wants, we can, before 18th of March, we can just get a separate Zoom and brainstorm about how to arrange it so it will be real fun. But my suggestion for the theme would be liberals against, not communist or anarchist, but let's say not liberals. That's how I will.
I mean,
liberals versus whatever we are.
I think the anarchist tradition should look at its origins in liberalism. Liberalism was before, so it got taken over as a sort of fake. It's mythic. What we see is mythic liberalism, because they want a state, but like the original liberalism was just to throw off the state. Some people, I mean, because you could see this going very wrong to bring in somebody who's just basically doesn't think, but like bringing in this sort of strong Marxists, and that thing that they do is to say, oh, we have the totality of society and then we divide it up, and you'll see that they have a really clear way to talk. It's a very specific thing, and they're kind of our friends because they're the Marxists in some sense. They're against capitalism, but they have that weird way of always doing it. So that might, and you could easily find those Marxist reading groups who are super, like the Das Kapital reading groups, who are super, like I hung out with one of them so I could try to read that Das Kapital stuff and just think, and it was an ethnographic experience. I felt like I was surrounded by an alien tribe. It was really fun. I mean, they're nice people and all that, but like the kind of glowing light of the Hegelian Marxism materialist dialectic method was, and then it's also quite interesting because you'll learn something, because Marx does have a fairly interesting analysis of stuff. And the other one is, I don't know this, but very well, because I'm not out in America now, but the libertarian tradition has a quite extreme thing on markets and stuff like that, but they're kind of also on our team, at least in the sense that, I know anarchists who were able to get the libertarians to fight the Nazis and, in those types of things, because they said, like, So they don't have the same beliefs, but they were willing. So those would be kind of some of our nearby friends. And also maybe the liberals versus the authoritarians. Do you know what I mean? But I couldn't be bothered with. Some people are just everything I don't really want to deal with. Like, so I'm not really that excited about anybody, about Trump supporters, other than like a lot of them are pretty mad at capitalism because they've been screwed over. And that's a fair, and they do say some fair things about neoliberalism. It's just racism isn't really a deal breaker for them when they try to fight what they're fighting.
I just wanted to jump in real quick. I think Amy, you had your hand up as well, right?
Sorry. Yeah, I did. I was thinking about the fact that Simona was talking about the banning of the idea of both Nazism and communism. And I was thinking the way that groups use labels, bring them back in a bad way. I mean, like we see the Nazis among the Trump supporters. I think they have many of the same values, but they're not German people in the 1930s. You know, they're embracing and rebranding what I assume, all consider completely disgusting political and philosophical framework for a specific time and place. And so I think the whole thing with rebranding is that you have to be careful that someone else isn't using that brand. I mean, communism with a small c, as we're thinking about it in terms of society, is a beautiful thing, but it's also been used in a very brutal way. And I don't know that some people may not choose to rebrand it to embrace, you know, Stalin. That's all I got.
I think like just to one addition, I think your point, Amy, is like I realize like it's like when even like we think of rebranding, I wonder if like there's almost like a postmodern dimension to it, right? Like in the sense of truth or like the lack of truth. Because you know, like I guess the idea is that you can rebrand something because anyone can lay claim to it without really worrying about its history. But I would say something like small, there's a quote true story, at least relatively true. And like I guess problem is like how far we are today from that story when we think of like mythic communism, you know, like we associate it with USSR and so on. Which is another reason, you know, I guess like when we think of rebranding, it's about like reclaiming something for the sake of it. But in our case, it's more about like reclaiming something because I think we believe beyond the like we're telling the truest story, isn't it?
I think part of that too with the rebrand or the reclaiming is you have to think of it tactically, right? So I'm hopefully being able to see an old friend of mine this weekend who's like a disaffected Republican. Probably fits into the tone of liberal, although from how we define it, although he would hate it if I called him a liberal. But I could see myself using this discussion about communism with him because it would be part of a longer discussion. But I also wouldn't use that tactically almost in most other large places where I couldn't have that discussion because people would not know what I'm talking about. So it's like if I have a moment to explain it, I'll use the word. If I don't, I probably won't just because they haven't read what I've read, so I'm not going to use the word.
Yeah, that's true. That's back to the language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what kind of words to use. So it's very important if you do the fighting club, how you formulate the disagreements. It really should not be about communism and capitalism. Because, we would
Maybe
not
there can be rules in the fight, as in like do not use terminologies, but only processes and actions. As in, I mean, like acts and processes can be discussed without using terminologies because, you know, there are different ways people define socialism and such things. perhaps those minimal ground rules can be set, which could actually bring out new things in the debate, you know, a new way to engage in that discussion without using terminologies, because I feel like we've been talking about language and the inadequacy of language today a lot. So perhaps those things can be brought out in this tension of the fight.
Yeah.
Isn't there a way of having differences of opinion and at times quite extreme ones and debating it? You know, I'm not talking about discussing with fascists, but with people from the anarchist left to the middle right, or business people even, who might defend free market capitalism. Isn't there a way of having those kind of debates without personalizing, without having the discussion that centers around the ideas and not attacking the individual themselves? You know, because sometimes it can be useful to adopt a mindset in order to try and understand it, and sometimes it can be important to be provocative and even say things that you don't quite mean in order to kind of work things out. You know, I personally think it's a very healthy thing, but maybe that's just maybe that's easy kind of liberal educational stuff. I personally, I'd be really interested in some discussions about China, for example. You know, is it state capitalism? Is there something to defend in it, or what? You know, I personally have my own opinions, but I'd be interested to hear other people's.
Yeah, that's very valuable what you're saying. We were thinking with TJ that maybe in order to hear the other side, we can propose two people just to have a fighting club by switching on opinions. So we can ask, let's say, China supporter to play the other. So that's the other side. That's a very classical exercise, psychological exercise to imagine the other. So the idea is just to have a series of very short, very theatrical conversations that could be as fun as possible. And of course, it should not be personal, because if it's a fighting club, it should have some rules. It will be a game, not to play. We are not going to, you know, real fight. So the question is what kind of rules, and that's what we're discussing now. So maybe we can have another time. Whoever want to join, we can set up time now. TJ, do you want to set up the time for the next week? And we'll just invite people, and whoever want to join can join us. Maybe like what would be the good day? Do you have an opinion, TJ?
Yeah, I'm open Monday through Thursday, so we can just say what, Tuesday seems to be good for some people.
Yeah, okay, cool. Tuesday. Tuesday 8 or earlier?
Yeah, sounds great to me. I think that's since we're meeting at 8, lots of people from here should be able to make that time, hopefully.
Can I jump in quickly? Sorry, to say I have a friend who would be perfect for this. He's a philosopher and he's an amazing person, but he really is a fan of free market capitalism, and he absolutely loves debating people, and he's a brilliant listener. He's just one of my favorite people on the planet. And I think not only would he love to debate, but it might actually be beneficial to get him in the initial conversation to help set the rules as well, if you guys would be interested in me bringing him.
Yeah, totally cool.
Cool.
I have an interesting question too. So we can get our liberals and our communists or our Marxists, but who's going to represent us? Who's our star fighter?
Good question.
Two other points is, one is thinking of this as alliance building. So if you're going to go up against people, you find some people who are your friends and you compete with them. And so we build, you know, we kind of have arguments with the people who are slightly closer to us and try to build connections. And just the other one is internal fights. So I bet we could pull out the stereotypes that activists have of artists and the stereotypes that artists have of activists, and we could definitely create a fight there because many of us will be, because many of us cross over those two boundaries, will be aware of that kind of fight. and annoyed by it or frustrated by it. I think that would be a really fun one.
Yeah, actually Michael's totally right, because the whole idea of fighting club came out of disagreement in the Museum of Care. So it's will be perfectly fine to set up like internal fights. But also the idea of the fighting club is not to kill somebody. it's about just having a different way of expressing opinions and coming to agreements. And our culture, like for me, for example, it's very difficult to be engaged in a productive fight with somebody. So you're supposed to always be polite and agree. And if you disagree, that's a kind of a problem. It's an awkward social situation. No, we don't know how to handle that. At least I don't know who knows. So this is just an attempt to set up a playful way of being openly disagree, and then try to figure out how to deal with this. And I don't think we should have a representative of our side, because again, we are not a political party. We don't need to, protect the values. I think our values, whoever is sharing these values, they will protect themselves just by being, in this setup where you can talk. Because the major things, nobody can talk. No, everything is kind of hijacked by this big media and, unspoken rules. That's the biggest problem. That's I think what is killing this everyday communism. Because I don't believe anybody's benefits of living in the fascist societies or totalitarian societies. And coming back to Rob's first question, in Soviet Union, I very well remember how it's started to fall apart. It started to fall apart from above, from the power. Also because these people understood that they can privatize everything, but also because it was kind of it was sad to live in the way how Soviet Union was arranged, So I think even like a horrible vampire, scary capitalist who is like want to fire everybody, also don't want to live alone in a planet that just has 50 degrees everywhere and looking how the humanity are dying. So they just don't know how to reset the rules. They don't know, at least that's my belief. So I don't think we should convince everybody to become a communist or anarchist. That's not a good task for me.
Yeah, I'd also like to keep in mind that most of the participants will not be the ones arguing. So the vast minority actually are the ones, the two people who are, arguing against each other. And I do agree with Chomsky, who pointed out that debates are an utterly irrational institution which should not exist in a reasonable world. Because, the assumption is that you've got your position, the other person has their position, and you're going to stick to them no matter what happens, no matter what you say to each other, which is like against, rationality, because rational people say, oh, no, that's a good argument. Maybe I'll think about it and change my mind. You can't really do that in a debate. Otherwise, it would not be a debate. So it's fundamentally irrational. But the listeners, they can talk, they can think, they can be rational as they want, as they think about what they see. And if the person that you agree with happens to make really bad arguments and, so-called loses the argument, then, people can discuss it and figure out what was a good argument there. What would I have responded, and we can do research. And I've learned a lot from, looking at what people say online. And since it's text, you get time to, research before you talk. And it really helped me, like arguing as a libertarian or an alt-right misogynist or something. That drove me to research a lot of things that I wouldn't otherwise have done. So there's usefulnesses to it. It's irrational, but there's also rational, useful outcomes, in my view, at least.
I think that goes back to the rules too, of like, you can't be keeping people from being cheap, right? Not like, we obviously just don't want like name calling or other type of just like cheap tactics that actually isn't getting people to actually think about their ideas and challenge ideas. So I think that's part of it, is you have to actually learn to defend yourself, not from a bullying tactic, but from a logical tactic.
We almost
right? And so just looking at the time, we're almost at us. So sense check, like, should we wrap up or?
And it is as the last things personally ask Vasily to to kind of wrap it up and express his points, because that was very, like, I was like really what he's going to say. Was waiting all the time, and then you raise your hand and then you kind of stop, and I was like
Oh yeah, because there are so many people who didn't say anything. No, I just wanted to go back to what Muna was saying at the very beginning of the conversation about the meaning of communism, and I think it would be good to, I just thought that it would have been good to unpack, but it's a bit late now. You know, we just unpack this from each according to their abilities, ... You know, and ask what is actually common in communism. And my sense is that it's something that should be shared unconditionally. And in fact, I think this is what most meant by this expression of this term of total reciprocity. The things with from each according to their abilities is that it sounds a little bit like a slogan and a rebranding if you want, and perhaps more importantly, it's a slogan that quickly runs into difficulties, as Michael was saying earlier. It was, what happens when the abilities and the needs are completely disproportionate? You slip into hierarchy. So I was just wondering if it would be better to say something like from each according to their more or less equal abilities to each according to their more or less equal needs, which sounds a bit that's not as elegant, but it might be a bit more accurate. So that was just a comment, and I just wanted to know what you were thinking about that.
yeah, I was just thinking about better way to say it, but it's true. I agree with that. Well, I was also thinking,
what are these abilities that he's talking about? What are these needs? In some other papers, I think he might actually be referring to our vital needs, a little bit like what Moss was saying. I don't know. That was just like food for thought, really.
Yeah, totally. He was
I feel like there's two. Sorry.
Yeah, David was saying everybody is sharing the food and water, and it's just something unbelievable if you don't share the food and water and shelter with the people who doesn't have it. And definitely everybody kind of feel awkward. Like I'm living now in this fancy part of London, and every day in front of my window, a homeless person is coming at like 11 o'clock and leaving at 6 o'clock in the evening. So everybody from the building is coming and giving him something, food and stuff like that. And the building are empty because it's a rich people who went to live outside of London. And he's sleeping in the street. It's raining, it's cold. It's just so insane. And I think everybody feels awkward and bad. And it's just not understandable what to do. It's not my apartment. I cannot invite him. It's like 20 square meters, but it's literal inclination of, I think, everybody who's working to do something about that.
Yeah, that's something I also struggle with. So in my job, I'm a social worker as well. And I was told recently by my boss that I should empower people and treat them as equal and let them kind of be autonomous and not take too much responsibility. Basically, what they're telling me in a way is to switch off, to not become too involved emotionally. And for me, it's like, how can they're not equal? We are not, on a humanity level and sociality, if we're talking about these basic needs that we all have, yes, we are equal, but at the same time, in the structure of how things seem to be working now, even if we don't call it capitalism, it's still very much hierarchical, and on that level, they're, you know, I have more power. So it's yeah, I don't know what that means in terms, like, what does it mean? What is their abilities and mine? You know, like, I speak English, they don't speak English. They can't, some of them cannot read and write.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of like David's upcoming book, because I think I could get this wrong, but I feel like one of the things they realized when they were working on it was like inequality has always existed historically, like even with amongst hunter-gatherers. So it's kind of like a false, like kind of like a red herring gets thrown about, like, oh, let's reduce inequality. It's like someone, as you showed, like it's like the second picture. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should have a kind of, not a fight between each other, but some kind of points where we disagree with the notion of communism that just exists now in the mass consciousness, and attack that, starting from communism being like all this monopolistic capitalistic country called communist countries, and also the notion of equality, and probably much more. Maybe it's for another conversation. Good themes. Equality, yeah, one of them for sure.
What interests me in debates and in fighting.
We cannot hear you, Simona, for some reason, or I cannot.
What is interesting for me in debates is that truth is always well-rounded. There is, in my opinion, there is always one side of the truth that you cannot see because it's on the other side of the sphere, like, and there is some reason in every point. I think. I mean, I offered to be a devil's lawyer for liberalism because there are reasons in it for me, even in free market, even in free market ideology. There is some truth in this ideology, or it couldn't work at all.